The sea was restless that morning. Thick fog clung to the coastline like wool draped over damp shoulders, swallowing the trees and muffling the birdsong. Through that gray veil came the dull rhythmic beat of oars long and low, like a war drum heard through earth. The Northumbrian coast, hardened by wind and tide, had known invaders before. But something about this Viking fleet was different. 15 dragon-prowed longships glided into view, their black sails slack against the morning mist. Seabirds wheeled overhead, screeching, perhaps warning, perhaps just greedy for scraps. The tide carried the vessels forward until the hulls scraped gravel and sludge. Men with braided beards and axes leapt into the shallows, boots splashing as they pulled ropes ashore. They had names like Ivar, Sigurd, and Bo. They wore leather and mail, rings of bone on their fingers, and wolf pelts over their backs. Their faces were painted with streaks of ash and ochre, making their eyes look hollow and angry. For them, this was just another raid, another Saxon village, another pile of silver to load and go. Yet the land greeted them oddly. Their fire wouldn't catch right away. The fog thickened rather than lifting. One of their men stepped into a hollow and vanished, screaming, only to be pulled out with a bloodied leg from a sinkhole masked in heather. Crows sat close watching from fence posts, unmoved. The Jarl, a man named Einar, stood on a ridge with his hand on the pommel of his sword, squinting through the mist. The village they were after was supposedly called Clunwich, not far inland. It had cattle, stored grain, and Evan rumor had Ida silversmith. That was worth the trip. But the men were jumpy. One swore he saw figures walking the tree-lined barefoot women in white robes with faces like chalk. Another claimed he'd heard whispering from inside a hollow tree. Einar spat and waved them forward. "Ghosts don't bleed," he muttered. The fleet made camp on the beach that first night. Tents went up, fires lit, salted fish boiled, and flatbread baked on hot stones. But again, the fire smoked too much. The wind shifted too quickly. The dogs they kept wouldn't stop whining. One slipped his leash and ran toward the hills, yelping. That night they tried to drink. Mead, beer, even the last of their honey wine from Dublin. But something about the air made it taste different. Coppery, like old blood and wet grass. Still the men drank and sang and arm-wrestled under a wavering moon, and far up the hill, in a thick grove of elder and yew, a single lantern flickered behind shuttered windows. The woman inside moved slowly from table to hearth, stirring a thick black liquid in a copper cauldron. Bees buzzed lazily around her head, as if waiting. Her name was Elgifu, and though she didn't look like much, short, thin, with eyes like flint and hands always sticky with something, there was something about her the villagers never quite understood. Some said she'd been raised by a Roman nun in the ruins west of Hadrian's Wall. Others swore she'd been stung by 1,000 bees as a girl and never flinched. She spoke little, but when she did, people listened, even when she was talking nonsense, especially then. On the second day, the Vikings left the beach. They came in 3 units, spreading wide through the scrubland, cutting paths with axes and machetes. Smoke curled behind them as they burned outlying homes and barns. Clunwick was still hidden, but they'd find it soon. Still, strange things followed. A man cut his foot on a thorn that festered black by nightfall. Another found a lamb, freshly slaughtered, hung upside down from a tree branch, its fleece painted with circles of blue dye. A third tripped and fell into a ditch that was dry, yet covered in a crust that crackled like dried honeycomb. When they broke it open, a swarm of wasps rose in a fury and chased 3 of them into the brush. Einar's second in command, Hrolf, said they were cursed. Einar punched him in the face. "We've taken Jorvik, lads. We've sacked monasteries from Wessex to the Hebrides. We are the fear of this land, not the other way around." Still, when night came again, the firewood smoked and crackled like green sap, and the moon refused to show. Something watched from the hills. Einar could feel it. On the third day, they finally reached Clunwick. It looked small, quiet, more sheep than people, No walls, no guards. Perfect. But no one cheered. No one ran. The villagers were there, yes, but they stood in the square with buckets of water and smoldering torches. They said nothing, just waited. And then a woman stepped forward. She was draped in homespun cloth dyed a yellowish brown. Her hair was plaited in a tight crown around her head, and she carried a wooden staff carved with bees and spirals. She smiled. No one else did. She didn't speak, just tapped her staff once on the cobblestones and turned back into the crowd. As if she were merely checking to see that the invaders had arrived on time, Einar felt the first sliver of doubt wedge under his ribs. That night the Vikings feasted on what they had looted from nearby hamlets: smoked meat, loaves of bread, dried apples. But there was little joy. Every log thrown on the fire hissed like it wept. One man swore he bit into a meat pie and found something that looked like a fingernail. At the top of the ridge, hidden in a ring of trees, Elgifu sat before her cauldron. She hummed to herself and stirred slowly. The steam from the pot rose in strange curling patterns. Around her, wooden crates filled with beeswax candles, dried herbs, and sealed clay jars waited. By the time the fire died down in the Viking camp, the wind had begun to shift again, and in the distance the soft, low hum of bees could be heard on the breeze. Elgifu rose before the dawn, her bare feet finding cold, familiar grooves in the wooden floor. The air inside her cottage smelled of beeswax, nettle, and the sharp tang of old vinegar. A small swarm of bees, already awake, hung near the shuttered window like a soft-breathing curtain of gold and black. She whispered to them in Old Saxon, words meant for insects and the quiet hours of the world. Outside, the village of Clunwick was stirring, though not from sleep. They had hardly slept in days. Every household had its role. The men collected firewood and sharpened tools. The children gathered feathers and wool. The women sealed jars, carried baskets, and lined rooftops with broken pots filled with smoke fodder and strange, spicy herbs. The Vikings were close. Everyone knew that. But it wasn't panic that moved Clunwich, it was rhythm, routine. They followed Elgifu's instructions the way they followed the seasons. They trusted her. They always had. Clunwich sat in a low basin surrounded by hills and old forests. Roman stones still lingered at its edge, scrumbled walls and broken baths, some now serving as sheep pens or rain basins. In the very center stood a worn stone circle, its purpose long forgotten but still treated with reverence. Elgifu lived nearest to it, in the oldest cottage, which smelled of dried honey and sometimes strangely pears. She had not always been strange, or rather, she had not always seemed strange. Her father had been a brewer, her mother a herbalist. Both had died young in the same winter. Elgifu had taken up their work and then gone further. She read runes and Roman ledgers. She mapped the timing of hives and the temperament of bees. She knew when the apples fermented too fast, when the yarrow turned bitter, when the air buzzed in ways that meant trouble. The villagers said she could predict births and bad winters just by touching the underside of a leaf. She could also make a salve for festering wounds that smelled like spoiled cider but healed twice as fast as anything from the monks. It was said that bees never stung her. That part was true. Elgifu's garden looked more like a witch's pantry than a patch of earth. Nettles taller than children grew beside dried stalks of hemlock and rue. Pots of thick liquid sat half-buried in cool soil, their wax seals tight and marked with symbols. Dozens of beehives lined the stone wall, each one shaped like an upside-down basket and humming with low, sleepy noise. She talked to the bees daily. They responded in their way. This morning she lit a small cone of moss and feather in a clay dish and let the smoke curl up to the rafters. Then she poured a ladle of thick fermented liquid from a barrel that had once held salted herring. It splashed into the cauldron with a sour plop. The scent was sharp apples gone too far, with undertones of ammonia and decay. She stirred slowly, watching the steam rise. Her hands never hesitated. Outside, men rolled large copper pots to the edges of the rooftops. Women filled bags with crushed berries and something black and sticky pitch mixed with stingers. Children braided ropes to lower buckets from windows. The village looked ordinary at first glance, but something was being built behind the facades, something careful and strange. Word had spread of the nearby Viking raid. The village of Dunseth had burned. 3 homes still smoldered near the old stone road. A cart of refugees had passed through Clunwick 2 days ago, faces drawn tight with fear, their oxen foaming with exhaustion. They'd brought warnings and the remnants of their meager wealth. Elgifu had taken what they offered, not in silver but in chamber pots, used ones, preferably not yet rinsed. Everyone found that peculiar, but no one questioned her. She was assembling things. Not weapons exactly, not traps in the usual sense, but something. Buckets of vinegar, jars of wax, iron pans smeared with fat, leather slings, wooden rods sharpened to a dull point and wrapped in moss, and bees, always bees. The men of Clunwich had tried to prepare for war before, once, maybe twice, when bands of raiders had passed too near. But Elgifu had stepped in then too with her way of turning battles into misfortunes for the other side. Like the time she buried boiled onions in the fields, and days later the horses of the enemy refused to cross, spooked by a scent they couldn't understand, or when she hung flax dolls soaked in mead from the trees, and the enemy commander fell ill and vomited for 3 days after marching under them. She didn't fight. She played the field like a harp, one strange note at a time. This time, she told them, they would need smoke and heat and something the Vikings would never expect. They think us soft, she told the village leaders 3 nights before, so we must give them softness, sweetness even, then turn it inside out. They thought she was mad, of course, but she had been right before, and now with the enemy so close none dared cross her. In the shadow of the old Roman watchtower, Elgifu had chosen her battlefield. Not in the square, not in the open fields, but beneath the broken archways where echoes carried strangely and the wind danced in tight spirals. She had hauled up jars sealed with wax, filled with bees that had been starved for 2 days, just enough to make them aggressive. She had arranged boiling pots on the highest stone ledges, wrapped in wet cloth to keep the heat in. Below, ropes and pulleys had been fixed. Buckets of fermenting filth had been disguised as tribute. They were not preparing to fight. They were preparing to bewilder. In the late afternoon, the sound of horns echoed from the ridge. The Vikings had spotted the village at last. Children were ushered indoors, animals brought into cellars, but not a single villager fled. They took their stations. And at the far end of the village, Elgifu stood before her cauldron one last time. She added a final ladleful of fermented piss and apple mash, then dropped in a clump of dried fungus she'd found under the old oak near the marsh. The surface shimmered, then bubbled. She smiled and whispered something to the bees. A sound answered her deep and droning from the hives, from the forest, from the hills. They were ready. The sun broke through for the first time in days, slicing across the fields in golden shafts that made the dew shimmer like glass. But it brought no warmth. The villagers of Clunwick stood still beneath its light, waiting. The air was too quiet. Even the birds had taken shelter. Only the sound of boots crunching dried grass echoed from the ridge above. The Vikings had arrived. They came in waves, moving with the ease of men who had conquered before. Shields on backs, axes swinging lightly at their sides, they approached the village as if they had already claimed it. Their leader, Jarl Einar, rode a sturdy gray horse down the winding slope, flanked by a few scouts and a dozen warriors. The houses looked simple, the people poorer than expected. But there was no panic. That much was odd. Einar signaled a halt. His eyes scanned the village square where a small crowd had gathered. A few old men, a group of women, and most oddly children perched on windowsills or standing barefoot in the dusty road, all watching him with that same infuriating calm. Then, from behind the nearest hut, a woman stepped forward. She looked barely taller than a child herself, wrapped in a robe the color of old parchment, and carrying nothing but a wicker basket. She had gray-brown eyes, a braid pinned tightly around her head, and a mouth that never seemed to smile, but didn't frown either. Elgifu. Einar narrowed his eyes. She set the basket on the ground between them and backed away without a word. Inside were honey cakes and small jars, sealed with wax and tied with simple twine. A peace offering? Einar didn't trust it, but his men were already descending past him, laughing and jostling one another, eyeing the homes, the fields, the livestock. One even plucked a honey cake from the basket and bit in with a grin. Soft as cowards, he chuckled, crumbs falling from his beard. Einar raised a hand and barked orders. The village was to be searched, weapons confiscated, tribute gathered. No killing unless provoked. He kept his horse still as his men swept forward, scattering chickens and frightening the goats. The villagers remained oddly still. Some even nodded, like they'd been expecting this all along. By sunset, Clunwick's homes had been searched and its stores emptied. A few barrels of mead, small casks of dried fish, some grain and cheese, nothing impressive. Still, it would feed the company for a day or two, and there was that strange drink, thick and sour-smelling, found in several sealed jugs behind Elgifa's cottage. The raiders joked that it must be a local spirit. They tapped one open. The first man to drink made a face like he'd been stung by a wasp. But then he laughed. It was strong, far stronger than any ale, and left an aftertaste like overripe fruit left too long in the sun. A murmur of interest spread. Within the hour, they'd opened every jug and were passing the liquid freely among themselves. Elgifu watched from behind her shutter, arms folded. What the Vikings drank was no ordinary brew. It was made from fermenting windfall apples, nettle vinegar, honeycomb sludge, and yeshurine. Not fresh, of course, carefully aged, left to sit for months in sealed pots, the contents transforming from waste to weapon. It wasn't just the taste that mattered. It was what came next. As the sun dipped and the shadows stretched, the first wave of dizziness began. Then the sweating. Laughter followed not normal laughter, but high-pitched, uneven cackles that echoed off the rooftops and made the goats uneasy. The drink had been laced with ergot fungus, carefully harvested from rye left in damp storage. Elgifu had tested it on rats, then birds. It took just the right dose, not enough to kill, but more than enough to disorient. The mead, too, had been subtly altered. It smelled of sweetness, but was heavy with fumes that numbed the mouth and stung the sinuses. Made from ruined combs and overboiled wax, it didn't warm the belly, it clouded the mind. By nightfall, half the Viking party was stumbling. A few had stripped down to the waist and were dancing in the square, shouting nonsense in Old Norse. Others lay under carts, giggling uncontrollably or weeping. One had tried to climb onto a rooftop and sing. The villagers watched from behind drawn curtains, silent as ghosts. Einar remained near the edge of the village, more cautious than most. He had sipped only once from the jugs, enough to taste the strength. He hadn't liked it. Now he stood with his arms crossed, watching as his warriors made fools of themselves. Then he heard it a low hum, faint at first, rising like a distant song from the hills. He turned toward the sound. The trees beyond the field swayed unnaturally, though there was no breeze. The hum grew louder. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the village. A pot had been thrown, launched into the center of the drunken crowd. It shattered on the cobblestones, releasing a writhing, buzzing swarm of bees into the air. Confused and angry, they shot upward in a cloud of wings and panic. Then another pot smashed, and another. The bees, disoriented from the sudden light and noise, attacked indiscriminately. They stung the first faces they found, bearded cheeks, bare arms, open mouths. Screams followed. Not of battle, but of confusion, of drunken warriors now flailing against invisible enemies. Some tried to run, only to be met by fresh volleys of smoke pots thrown from rooftops. The air filled with choking gray plumes, wet wool smoldered with pine needles and crushed beetles, sending stinging vapor into Viking lungs. One man rolled on the ground, howling. his face swelling from a dozen stings. Another swung wildly with an axe, hitting only air and a nearby cart. Einar drew his sword, bellowing for order, but his voice was lost in the chaos. His men could barely see, let alone obey. A few were vomiting from the effects of the brew. Others lay twitching, overcome by a combination of poison and panic. And still, more jars came, from slings, from rooftops, even dropped from trees. Clay amphorae packed with bees, sealed just hours earlier, now bursting open mid-air to release their frenzied passengers. Elgifu had selected her bees carefully. Not just any hive would do. These were black bees fiercer, quicker to sting, and known to swarm when disturbed. She had bred them for seasons in isolation, feeding them thyme and marjoram, then starving them just long enough to make them angry. Now they were doing exactly what she needed. The Vikings, mighty warriors of the north, were scattering like children before a summer storm. And Elgifu? She stood at the edge of the square, her robe fluttering in the smoke, bees crawling across her shoulders. She held a staff in one hand, in the other a lantern. She raised the lantern high. The next phase was about to begin. The lantern swayed in Elgifu's hand, casting soft amber light that rippled through the haze. She moved slowly, not as a warrior nor a leader, but as a conductor at the edge of a grand and terrible symphony. The smoke billowed around her in dense spirals, fed by the burning moss and nettle bundles hung from every rooftop. Inside each home, families held their breath, eyes pressed to cracks and shutters, hearts drumming. The bees had done their work. Viking yells had devolved into shrieks, curses, and erratic grunts as stung men stumbled through the village in full panic. They swung weapons at air, struck each other by mistake, or ran headlong into walls and carts. One man had plunged into a pig pen and was now buried beneath a mound of angry swine who wanted nothing to do with him. Elgifu turned her gaze uphill. Her next move was already underway. Half a dozen villagers, faces wrapped in damp cloth, sprinted through a hidden path leading to the old Roman tower. Behind them, pulled on wooden sledges and groaning under their weight, came iron-banded barrels, large, bloated things reeking of rot. These weren't for the Vikings to drink. They were for the wind. The tower sat perched on a slope above the village, open on three sides, its arches still miraculously standing after centuries. Elgifu had chosen it carefully. It caught the wind just right when it came from the east, and tonight, the wind obeyed. Inside the tower, earlier that week, she and her small crew had installed 2 long, shallow vats filled with her infamous brew. Not the drink the one meant for battle, the one that bubbled and smoked with chemical violence. Fermented apple waste, sheep urine, human urine, vinegar, pepper, and crushed hornets' nests. Left in the sun and fed nettle until it glowed, then boiled down to a syrup so acrid it could stun a rat from 3 paces. Now the vats were being heated from beneath by low fires, smothered in damp straw to make them smoke rather than flame. The smell hit first. It curled out of the tower in thick waves, then swept downhill like a crawling mist carried by the wind. Back in the square, the Vikings paused. Even in their delirium, they noticed something had changed. The air, already heavy with stingers and smoke, now stank like a battlefield latrine crossed with overcooked cider and an undertone of something wrong. It didn't smell natural. It smelled planned. Einar, halfway through shouting at a fleeing soldier, caught a lungful and doubled over, coughing. The steam was rich with ammoniac burn. It scraped the back of the throat, made eyes water instantly. Some men dropped their weapons and clutched their faces, stumbling blindly. One vomited into his own helmet. The air wasn't just disgusting, it was debilitating. That had been Elgifu's intent. She knew she couldn't overpower them with blades. They had numbers, strength, and armor, but they weren't prepared for the tools she wielded: biology, fermentation, chemistry. Not in the scientific sense, but in the practical sense. The wisdom of hedgerows, cellars, and old crones. She hadn't invented this, no. The idea of boiling nightshade or brewing blinding smog from vinegar and ashes went back centuries. Roman soldiers had done it. Persian war elephants had choked on it. She had simply improvised. Now, with the fog-like cloud pouring into the village, the Viking camp devolved into pure chaos. Some tried to flee, but the smoke was everywhere. It hugged the ground, thick and sulfurous, rising from the alleys and curling under doorways. Above them, from the rooftops, the villagers emerged not with swords, but with pots. They poured more of the boiling liquid from slings suspended on pulleys. It splashed onto thatched roofs, the earth, sometimes even unlucky invaders. A few were scalded, though the intent was not death but disorientation. Steam erupted, thick and stinging. Another wave of bees was released, smaller this time, but even angrier. These had been kept warm near the hearths, kept hungry. The combination was too much. Einar tried to rally his men again, but most could no longer hear him. His voice was one more sound in a cacophony of retching, screaming, buzzing, and the low, steady hum of boiling madness. That was when the second skirmish began. Only this time the villagers attacked. Not with swords, but with long sticks wrapped in smoldering moss, with slings carrying jars of bramble thorns dipped in pitch, with ropes tied to buckets that dropped from second-story windows, splashing more of Elgifa's strange broth onto the ground below. From behind hay carts and alley shadows, the youth of Clunwick launched bundles of nettles mixed with hair and pine tar, designed to stick to armor and sting through fabric. Even the livestock joined in their way-goats released to run wild in confused movement, chickens flapping in clouds that startled raiders into making mistakes. It was no longer a fight, it was a fever dream of battle. And through it all, Elgifu walked like a shade. The bees stayed with her, dancing around her head like a living crown. Her staff tapped the cobbles with measured rhythm. She stopped only once to dip a ladle into one of the vats and pour a fresh stream of boiling liquid onto the stones, creating a curtain of vapor between herself and a Viking who had spotted her. The man fell to his knees seconds later, clutching his face. The village bells, unused in peacetime, now rang low and slow. Not a warning, a dirge. By midnight, the Vikings had broken. They began to flee not in rank, not even in groups, but individually, like drunkards fleeing a burning tavern. Some dropped shields, others lost boots. They didn't stop to recover wounded or gather supplies. They just wanted out. Einar was the last to leave. He stood at the edge of the village, sword still drawn, eyes bloodshot. Bees clung to his furs. His skin was welted and red. His nose was running. He stared at Elgifu, who stood at the far end of the street, framed by flickering firelight and steam. He didn't speak. He simply turned and disappeared into the dark. The wind shifted once more, carrying the worst of the stink away. The fires were doused. The villagers stepped from hiding. Elgifu exhaled, long and quiet. Then she whispered to the bees, "Tomorrow, we clean." Smoke still coiled gently above the rooftops of Clunwick as the first streaks of morning sun cut through the mist. Birds were beginning to return, chirping cautiously from hedgerows and treetops, as if uncertain whether the strange events of the night had truly passed. The village, battered but intact, stood quiet and still. Its silence laced with something between awe and disbelief. In the square, the evidence of what had occurred remained scattered like the remnants of a fevered dream. Broken jugs, dropped weapons, and the occasional abandoned Viking shield lay where they had fallen. The cobblestones were slick with residue from Elgifa's concoctions, an alchemical soup of bee venom, fermented nightmare, and boiled nettle oil. The stench had mellowed, but a faint sourness still clung to the air like a memory that wouldn't fade. No bodies. That was the strangest thing. Despite the scale of the chaos, no Viking had died, at least not here. They had fled in madness and pain, some stung nearly blind, others still vomiting as they ran. But the villagers had not killed them. That too had been part of Elgifa's plan. "I don't need to kill them," she had said, almost offhandedly. in the council hut a week before. I need them to fear us. Fear keeps armies away longer than swords ever do. Still, the people of Clunwich walked through the aftermath with caution. Some carried buckets of water to rinse the stones. Others poked at odd piles with pitchforks, as though expecting the madness to return at any moment. The children had been forbidden to come outside yet. The bees still lingered, restless but no longer angry, drifting through the haze like they were searching for instructions. Elgifu emerged at last from her cottage, blinking slowly in the filtered sunlight. Her robe was stiff with dried vinegar and sticky resin. Her hair clung in strands to her cheeks, but her face bore no sign of weariness. She looked satisfied. Beside her walked two girls, no more than 10, each carrying a small bundle of herbs wrapped in cloth. They followed her like priestesses, silent and steady, their bare feet blackened by soot. Elgifu made her way to the square and raised her arms. "We clean now," she said, not loudly, but it carried. That was enough. Without complaint, the villagers began. Rain barrels were tipped, brooms brought out, and every square of stone was scrubbed with sand and sage water. The rooftops were doused to remove the lingering pitch. Bees were gently smoked back into their hives with puffs of dried lavender. The jar slingers were dismantled, the nets untied, the boiling pots emptied and buried under layers of sod. All traces of war hidden again. At the edge of the field, old Osgar found something peculiar in the flattened grass, a broken shield with a dragon emblem charred along its curve. Stuck to its surface was a large honeycomb, half melted, the bees long gone. Embedded in the wax was a small round token medal, not silver but etched with strange lines. He turned it over in his hand and shrugged. Another oddity for the compost heap. The only person who didn't return to their home was Elgifu. She walked beyond the village borders, basket on her hip, staff in hand. She moved with purpose, not like someone in mourning or celebration, but like someone finishing what she started. Beyond the ridge was the hamlet of Dunseth, or what remained of it. Burned timbers stuck up from the earth like the ribs of a dead ox. The fire had eaten nearly everything. A few charred crates, a blackened yoke, that was all. Except the bees. Elgifu's hives had not always lived in Clunwich. When she was younger, she had traded knowledge with an old woman in Dunseth who kept a breed of honeybee particularly attuned to mountain time. The woman had died long ago, but the bees had thrived until the Vikings came. Elgifu crouched by the remains of a fallen shed and uncovered a wax-sealed pot hidden beneath the stones. Inside buzzed a single trembling colony, weak but alive. She lifted it with reverent hands and placed it in her basket. "You'll come home now," she murmured. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught a glimpse of footprints, deep, panicked indentations in the mud. They led down the slope toward the river, more than one set, wounded, fleeing. That meant the Vikings hadn't made it far. Perhaps they had been swept away by the current. Perhaps they had scattered to the woods to lick their wounds. It didn't matter. She had sown enough fear to keep them from returning. Back in Clunwich, word was spreading among the villagers about what they had done, how they had faced the fiercest raiders in the known world, not with swords or arrows, but with bees, boiling filth, and cunning. Children were already turning the tale into games, tying reeds into hives, and pretending to chase away ghostly foes with honey sticks. At the council hut, Wulfric the miller was arguing again. "She's not right," he said to anyone who would listen. "It's not natural what she does." That weren't a victory, it was witchery. But no one answered him, not this time. Because this time they had seen what Elgifu could do. As twilight fell, the villagers gathered in the square again, this time for a quiet meal. Loaves of coarse bread, thick with oats, root vegetables roasted in the last of the autumn oil, and a single jug of clear mead brewed the honest way. They passed it with solemn hands, each taking a sip and offering a silent thanks. Elgifu stood near the circle of firelight, arms folded. A child brought her a cup. She took it, sipped once, then looked toward the darkening hills. The Vikings would not return tomorrow, but they would return. one way or another, and when they did, she would be ready, for she was no warrior. But she had war in her bones. The air in the hills above Clunwick was crisper now. The fog had finally lifted, leaving behind the golden stretch of early autumn, where sunlight came dappled through thinning trees and the wind smelled of drying leaves and wood smoke. But peace was a thin blanket warm enough for comfort, too thin to rely on. Elgifu walked alone up the winding trail beyond the pastures, her boots brushing fallen leaves, her breath misting slightly in the air. She had something hidden beneath her cloak, a small pouch of dried fungus, another of ground nettle root, and a waxed cloth bundle filled with dried dung from a ewe that had been fed only crushed berries and acorns. Ingredients, preparations, tools. Ahead, half covered by bramble and ivy, loomed the ruins of an old Roman watchtower. Unlike the newer cottages of Clunwich, this place bore the long weight of centuries. It stood crooked and cracked, one side having collapsed in a long-forgotten storm, but the main archway remained a heavy stone curve still resisting time. The tower overlooked the narrow valley and the two thin tracks that led east to the river and west to the sea. A natural vantage point. More importantly, a trap waiting to be reborn. She ducked through the arch and into the dim shade of its interior. Here, the smoke from the fire pit still lingered faintly, embedded into the stone. She had already used this place once to great effect. Now she meant to rebuild it properly more than a single knight's tool. Because rumors were beginning to return on the trade winds, ships landing again on distant shores, fires seen in the night across the moors, farmers missing sheep, a hunting party returning bloodied with tales of foreign men hiding in the gullies, sharpening blades and watching. It wasn't over, and next time it might not be Einar. Next time it might be worse. That very morning, a traveling monk had passed through the village, robes torn, face haggard, claiming to have seen a Viking camp in the marshes to the north. Dozens of them. They weren't raiding, not yet. Just watching, waiting. Elgifu knelt in the center of the tower, opened her bundles, and began laying out her strange tools in a wide circle. She had a plan. This time the trap wouldn't be reactionary, it would be set. Prepared days in advance, hidden in plain sight, waiting for a misstep. The first element was fire. Not ordinary fire, but cold-burning flames made from a mixture of dried cow bile and rendered wax fat. When lit, it would not crackle but smolder, releasing a thick, oily smoke that clung low and refused to rise. Mixed with crushed wormwood, it would burn the eyes and stir nausea without the need for open flame. She called it her ground fog. The children whispered that it could blind a ghost. The second element was the vat-shallow, stone-lined pits just beneath the floorboards, which the villagers had helped her dig during harvest. They would be filled with a fresh round of her infamous brew-boiled nettle and barley urine, sour apple mash, and bitter mold milked from damp sacks. They would not only stink, they would burn. Boiled and funneled through small pipes, they would spew upward like geysers when needed. And the final element, bees. Of course, not just bees, conditioned bees. Elgifu had been experimenting. Not many noticed, but she'd spent days with specific hives, feeding them select herbs, marking them with ochre dots on their thoraxes. She had discovered something odd when exposed to the scent of crushed marigold and elderflower together. The bees became significantly more aggressive. And when smoked with sage instead of lavender, they became confusedless, able to coordinate but more likely to sting at random, so she had made her own scent lure. A foul-smelling paste of marigold, elderflower, and rendered snail slime rolled into little orbs the size of a walnut. They could be flung by hand or tossed in small catapults, bursting with scent. She would bait the invaders herself. Back in the village, the preparations continued in quiet, measured rhythm. No one asked Elgifu what exactly she was doing. They had learned to trust her silences. If she asked for lard, they gave it. If she needed ash, they swept it from hearths and bagged it without question. When she requested 3 fresh chamber pots be left uncovered for 7 days near the compost mound, they did not blink, just complied. That was her power, not fear, faith. Elgifu returned to Clunwich late that evening with mud on her knees and moss in her sleeves. Her arms were full of herbs and her hair streaked with wax. She passed the council hut without looking in, even as Wulfric scowled at her from the doorway, muttering. Inside her cottage, bees buzzed softly in their hives, calm and orderly. The central cauldron sat cold, but she touched its rim gently as if greeting an old friend. She dropped her bundles beside it and reached for a different one sealed with a bit of amber and bound with black twine. She opened it carefully. Inside lay the last jar of her earliest experiment, the blend she had called sting water. A reduction of piss, vinegar, and fermented nightshade, it had never been used, not because it failed, but because it worked too well. It had knocked a grown man unconscious with just 1 lungful during a test in the marshes 2 winters ago. She stirred it gently, still potent, still waiting. She smiled. The next day she visited the beekeeper's grove 2 hills over, where an old man named Senric lived in solitude with 30 hives and no interest in gossip. She brought him bread and smoked fish, and in return he let her take 3 combs and a handful of queen cages. "You're building something," he said, his voice rasping with age. She didn't answer. He nodded, satisfied. Elgifu returned through the woods, carrying the queens in her cloak, wrapped in linen to keep them warm. Each one would birth a swarm more loyal than the last. If placed properly, they could anchor entire colonies within a few days. She intended to place them in hollow logs hidden just outside the paths near the village. If the Vikings came again and moved through the woods, they would disturb the nests unknowingly. The bees would defend, not for Elgifu, for their queens. That night, as the moon rose, she stood on her cottage roof and watched the darkened horizon. A breeze came down from the east, heavy with salt and brine. Somewhere far off, waves were breaking, ships would come again. But this time, Clunwick would not simply repel them, it would ruin them. Not with swords, with smoke, with stings, with terror. And with a woman who understood that war could be waged from a beehive just as surely as from a blade. The next morning broke sharp and windless, the kind of morning that carried sound too clearly and made the world feel tense, as if holding its breath. In the stillness, a long shadow moved across the sea's edge. On the horizon, sails rose, dark, curved shapes gliding silently across the silver-blue water like the fins of surfacing whales. At first there were 2, then 5, then more 11 in all. Sleek, fast longships with striped sails and low hulls, moving in near-perfect formation toward the coast just north of Clunwick. They didn't land with shouts or war horns this time. They came quietly, anchoring in the reeds and shallows near the mouth of the river, sending scouts ahead with knives and light steps, not axes and bold declarations. These men were not the raucous raiders of before. These were measured, coiled, and careful. Veterans. They were not here to loot. They were here to find out what had happened to Einar, and to finish what he had started. The leader of this second wave was a man named Brynjar, a cousin of Einar's, though more reserved and far more meticulous. He did not drink before battle. He wore armor made from boiled leather over chainmail, and he studied maps not just of the coastline but of wind, wildlife, and soil. He did not fear women or witchcraft. He did not believe in ghosts, but he had heard what happened at Clunwich. Wild rumors, sure, but spoken from multiple sources. A fleet scattered, men stung half-blind, mead laced with rot, boiling stink poured from rooftops, and bees. Always the mention of bees. Brynjar didn't laugh when he heard these stories. He made a mark on his map and said one word again. He would see this village for himself. On the 3rd day after their arrival, his scouts returned from the hills with a cart bearing strange cargo honeycakes and a barrel of strong-smelling drink left under a crooked oak near the edge of the woods, an offering, or bait. They delivered it to Brynjar at his makeshift camp beside the riverbank. The cakes were warm and glazed with pollen dust. The barrel was sealed with wax and stamped with an unfamiliar sigilla spiral carved by hand. Brynjar's men sniffed it, tested it. The liquid inside smelled of fruit, strong and sweet. A few warriors laughed and dared one another to drink, but Brynjar ordered it sealed again. "Well, feed it to the dogs first," he muttered. "If they die, well, bury it. If they dance, well, wait for the music to stop." Still, the mood in his camp began to shift. Strange things occurred, one by one. A sentry fell ill after touching his face with a hand that had scraped the barrel side. He claimed his vision blurred and he saw a woman in white standing between the trees, just standing, silently. A rabbit was caught near the fire pit, but when it was skinned, they found thick yellow wax pressed into its fur, and no one could explain how or why. Worse still, two of Brynjar's hounds, the ones fed the honey cakes, vanished in the night. No barking, no struggle, just gone. The next morning, one returned. It was covered in stings, howling with something like madness, biting at the air and then at itself. The men put it down with heavy hearts. Brynjar spat. "This is no magic," he growled. "It's a trick, a trap. He would spring it himself." That evening, Clunwick sent a messenger. Not a warrior, not even a man, but a girl no older than 12, barefoot and calm, walking across the fields with a basket of late summer pears and a folded note written in Old Norse. The words were crude but clear. "No fight. We offer peace. Share drink, take food, go in mourning." Brynjar stared at the girl, then at the basket. He waved her away, but he kept the pears. That night he sent a dozen men under cover of dark to circle behind the village, through the thickets near the western trail. They were ordered to take no torches, speak no words, and carry no metal. They moved like ghosts until they weren't alone. They had reached the honey pits, laid just beneath scattered grass and covered in a thin crust of moss and earth. The pits were shallow trenches filled with fermented honey, sludge-thick with sugar, rot, and just enough residue to gum up boots, slip hands, and attract wasps in the thousands. The first man stepped into one and sank nearly to the thigh. The sound he made echoed like a stone dropped into a hollow log. The wasps came before he could finish swearing. Not ordinary wasps. These were the yellow-jawed kind, the big kind, with thick thoraxes and angry wings. They had been fed on meat and smoke for days, and they had been disturbed. The ambush was over before it began. Of the 12 men, only 4 returned. One had swollen eyes and could not speak. Another's armor had been discarded in the field. The third had lost 3 fingers, and the fourth whispered only one word, bees. Brynjar did not rage. He did not panic. He ordered fire. At dawn, the second Viking wave descended on Clunwich, weapons drawn, determined to burn the village to cinders before another trick could be played. But they found the houses empty, the square deserted. The cottages were intact, the hearth still warm, bread cooling on windowsills. It looked like a living place, only just abandoned. But there were no villagers, not even a goat. Brynjar stood in the center of the square, breathing hard. He felt the wind shift. Then came the first hiss of steam, from the rooftops, from the towers, from the old stone well in the center of town. Boiling, stinking vapor erupted in sudden gouts, each one a lungful of chemical spite. Eyes burned, throats closed. One man fell backward, clutching his face and screaming. Then came the jars. Thrown from second-story windows and from trees beyond the square, they smashed with precise violence, each one filled with bees, so many bees, not just swarm storms, conditioned to sting, hungry, loosed in waves. They moved like a living net, seeking warmth, motion, and flesh. They went for the mouth, the ears, the eyes. Warriors dropped their weapons and screamed. Brynjar staggered backward, swinging wildly. He saw a figure then at the far edge of the field, standing on the back of a cart. A woman in pale robes, bees circling her shoulders like a halo. She did not run. She simply raised her hand and pointed. The third phase had begun. The stink of fermented mead and spoiled apples hung heavy in the morning air, the kind of sour tang that curled into nostrils and clung to the back of the throat. Brynjar, face puffed with stings and lips cracked from heat and smoke, staggered through the town square with one thought beating louder than the rest. What was in that drink? The barrels, the honey cakes, the pears, all of it. Poison in some way, but not poison that killed. No, this was something crueler. It unmoored the mind. The men who drunk from the gifts Elgifu had left those who ignored Brynjar's warning and indulged in the honeyed mead were not dead. They were laughing, louder than fire, cackling with eyes rolled back, rolling in the dirt, kissing stones and singing to the clouds. One of them danced naked with a hive pressed to his chest, stingers piercing his skin like tiny barbed prayers, and he welcomed it. Another had taken to chewing grass like a cow, then sobbing that the grass had spoken his true name. The drink Elgifu's special blend was a slow, winding madness, and she'd brewed it with surgical precision. Inside the mead were ingredients carefully chosen for chaos-fermented barley mixed with ergot fungus, the same mold that once ruined an entire French harvest and made entire villages see demons. Shed let it steep with rotting apples, sour nettle oil, and traces of henbane. Each ingredient had its own madness, and together they danced. Even those who hadn't sipped the mead were not safe. Some merely breathed the vapor from the cracked barrels and felt their legs weaken, their hearts flutter, their hands forget the feel of a sword. Brynjar tried to rally them. He howled orders through the choking square, but the warriors who could still stand were too dazed, too disoriented, swatting at invisible bees or giggling at the spinning clouds, and all around them the village pulsed, not with people, but with intention. Windows opened silently, doors creaked just wide enough for pots to tip and roll. From beneath floorboards, more smoke slithered thick, choking and oddly sweet. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a stage, and they were the actors in someone else's play. Brynjar stumbled backward and raised his sword, but the blade felt wrong in his hands, heavy, slippery, like it was whispering nonsense to his fingers. He hadn't drunk anything, not a drop. But the air itself was laced, and that's when he realized this village wasn't defending itself. It was performing, a trap not just of strategy but of sensory overload. And right on cue, the buzzing rose again. From barrels, from jars lobbed through the sky, from hive boxes hidden in cartwheels and hay bales and hanging over doorways. The bees. Some swarms moved in lines, organized, focused. Others came in wild clouds. Not just stings now, but pressure. They pushed at the men's faces, their ears crawled into armor seams. Some Vikings threw off their helmets and cloaks. Others dove into troughs and tried to submerge their heads. There was no escape, because the mead had broken their minds before the bees ever came. And still the woman on the cart stood, unmoving. Elgifu, the beekeeper, the brewer, the stormcaller. From her perch she saw the ripple spreading through the Viking line. A few had broken from the chaos and sprinted east toward the tree line. Some simply sat down, crossed-legged in the dirt, eyes glassy and mouths open. Elgifu gave a small nod to a boy standing near the edge of the well. He vanished for a moment, then returned with a pouch-thin leather tied at the top. He swung it overhead. Inside, another scent bomb packed with marigold and elderflower paste. He lit the wick and threw it high. The pouch burst midair with a pop, spreading its pungent perfume across the square. The bees shifted in response, agitated, charged, newly focused. A second wave. They struck like lightning sharp, wild and unrelenting. And this time they weren't just stinging, they were chasing. Brynjar, who had taken cover behind the stone well, knew he had to act. Whatever this was, demon's drink or nah, they needed to find the source. The woman. He charged toward the cart. His boots slapped through puddles of mead and shattered honey jars, his cloak trailing behind like smoke. He knocked over a barrel, pushed past a man who sat laughing into a shoe, and raised his axe. But before he could take another step, a figure rose from behind the cart. Not Elgifu. A boy barely 14, face smeared with soot and arms trembling, tossed a second pouch into Brynjar's path. This one didn't burst, it shattered. A ceramic jar of Stingwater Elgiphus forbidden concoction, the one she had vowed never to use. But the boy had known where it was hidden, and he'd waited for the right moment. The jar exploded at Brynjar's feet, releasing a cloud so foul, so acrid, it brought the warlord to his knees instantly. His eyes burned, his throat seized, his vision turned purple at the edges. He dropped the axe, gasped, and fell. Around him, the village rang with the sound of falling warriors one by one, dropping under the weight of confusion, pain, and invisible furies. The mead had softened their grip. The bees had broken their shape. The scent bombs had scattered their focus. And now, as the last of the conditioned swarm circled overhead, Elgifu finally stepped down from the cart. She walked slowly through the field of groaning, moaning giants, untouched and unbothered. The bees followed her like silk on wind, parting for her bare hands. She moved to Brynjar, knelt, and looked into his bloodshot eyes. "I told you," she said softly, though no one heard. "No fight. Take food. Go in mourning." She stood, turned, and walked back toward the edge of the village. Behind her, the square was silent save for buzzing and the slow, strange laughter of men who'd never see battle the same way again. The sun dipped low behind the jagged hills, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the bloodied earth. The surviving Vikings, only a handful now, were scattered like autumn leaves caught in a restless wind. Their once mighty force had been shattered not by swords or shields, but by something far stranger, the cunning of a Saxon woman and her uncanny arsenal of bees, poison, and boiling liquids. Brynjar lay on a bed of moss beneath a twisted oak, his face still swollen from the Stingwater's brutal bite. He could barely lift his head, but his mind churned, stubborn as the hardy weed growing through cracks in ancient stone. The defeat at Clunwick gnawed at his pride, but more than that, it left him bewildered. How had this woman, barely more than a shadow in his memory, managed to undo a force of seasoned warriors? The answer, he realized slowly, was the very earth itself. Elgiphus knowledge wasn't just in bees or poison, it was in understanding the land, the skies, and the invisible threads that bound both. She had turned the village into a living trap, using every element at her command to weave an impenetrable defense. He remembered the honey pits, not just traps of rot and bees, but cleverly concealed natural springs that steamed with sulfur, making the very ground treacherous. He thought of the smoke and the vapors rising from wells and hearths, carefully concocted mixtures of herbs that clouded vision and muddled the mind. And then there were the bees, millions of them, trained to strike and retreat with eerie precision. This wasn't mere luck or witchcraft, it was science, or something very close to it. In the distance, a low hum began to swell. Brynjar blinked against the dusk and saw a small swarm weaving through the trees, returning home to hives hidden deep in the woods. They carried the scent of the village with them, its sweetness, its bitterness, its danger. Elgifu had enlisted them as her army. Later, Brynjar would learn that this kind of beekeeping, called apiculture, was a secret art passed down through Saxon women for generations. They understood the rhythms of bees, the way to coax them, and the ways to turn their sting from mere defense into a weapon. It was a power few men respected. The boy who had thrown the Stingwater jar Rudolph sat nearby, bandaging his own arms. He had been Elgifu's apprentice, learning the subtle craft of brewing and beekeeping since childhood. His small hands, roughened by hive smoke and pollen dust, held a crooked knife. When Brynjar spoke hoarsely, Rudolph nodded silently, as if acknowledging a truth he'd long accepted, that strength wasn't always in swords and shields, but in patience, craft, and knowing nature's secrets. A curious fact Brynjar would remember later: the ancient Saxons believed that bees were messengers of the soul, carrying whispers between worlds. To kill a bee was said to bring misfortune, not just because of their sting, but because they guarded sacred knowledge. As night settled fully, the Vikings limped away from Clunwich, the sound of their footsteps muffled beneath the drone of countless wings. Back in the village, Elgifu tended her hives by firelight, the bees humming softly around her like a chorus of whispered secrets. She looked toward the darkening forest, where distant stars blinked awake one by one. Her battle was won not by strength or sword, but by understanding the wild, weaving chaos into order. And in that quiet victory, there was a lesson for all who would listen sometimes. The smallest things carry the greatest power. The weeks that followed the fall of the Viking attack at Clunwick passed in an odd stillness, like a quiet settling after a storm's roar. The Saxon villagers returned cautiously to their homes, repairing shattered roofs and cleaning soot-stained hearths, while all around the landscape seemed to hold its breath. Elgifu's name traveled through the countryside like a whispered legend. Some said she was a witch, others a guardian spirit sent by the old gods, but all agreed she had done something no one had dared before defeated an invading army without a blade. What few knew was the secret behind her victory, the hidden art of her beekeeping and brewing, and the ancient traditions she upheld in secret. Among the villagers, Elgifu's bees were considered more than just insects, they were protectors and omens. The wax from their hives was used to seal wounds and craft candles that burned with a steady, unwavering flame. The honey, thick and golden, was a medicine for coughs and broken bones, while the sting was feared but respected. The bees themselves had a strange place in Saxon lore. They were said to hold memories of the ancestors, their buzzing voices a link to the spirit world. Some believed that bees could sense approaching death or disaster, flying erratically before storms or battles. In fact, the Saxons had a peculiar practice related to bees that seems quirky today. They would sometimes baptize a newborn by placing a live bee on the infant's lip, believing the insect's gentle sting would grant courage and resilience. This tradition might sound odd now, but it reveals how deeply intertwined bees were with the people's sense of identity and survival. Elgifu herself was the latest in a long line of women who carried these traditions, passed down in whispered lessons beside the smoke of kitchen fires and among blooming wildflowers. One day, a traveling monk arrived at Clunwick, curious about the strange recent events. He noted the buzzing hives and the peculiar stillness that lingered, and recorded in his scrolls the tale of the Saxon woman who used boiling liquids and bees to turn back the Viking tide. He also recorded a less-known fact in the Middle Ages. Saxon and Viking cultures shared a fascination with honeybees that went beyond mere utility. Beeswax was so valuable that it was often used as currency or a form of tax payment, and monasteries kept elaborate apiaries, believing the purity of the bees' work reflected divine order. Elgifu, however, cared little for money or status. Her fight was for home and hearth, for children who would grow up knowing peace. Her brewing continued, not as a weapon, but as a safeguard. The mead she crafted was now shared cautiously, its recipe guarded closely, some ingredients changed, the ergot fungus removed, replaced by calming herbs like lavender and chamomile. The boiling pits remained filled with harmless water, their purpose shifted to irrigation. The bees, ever vigilant, buzzed on, and Clunwick flourished in their shadow. As the years passed, the story of Elgifu's cunning spread, transforming into myth. Parents told children of the woman who commanded bees to save their village, while poets wove the tale into songs of cleverness and courage. And through it all, one quiet truth endured sometimes. The fiercest warriors wield no sword at all, but patience, knowledge, and the wild power of nature itself. Spring crept softly back to Clunwick, brushing the land with tender greens and blossoms as if nature herself wanted to soothe the scars left by war. The village, now vibrant with renewal, bustled not only with farmers and craftsmen, but also with visitors, travelers drawn by the whispered tale of Elgifu and her beekeeping sorcery. One such visitor was a grizzled Saxon soldier named Wulfstan, who'd heard of the strange victory from distant neighbors. He sought Elgifu not for tales, but for a lesson. His own village faced growing threats from raiders, and he hoped the mysterious power of bees and brewing might tip the scales. Elgifu welcomed Wulfstan with a quiet smile, offering him a seat beside her hives as the bees hummed their ancient songs. She showed him the secret workings of her apiary, the hidden chambers, the intricate patterns of the honeycomb, and the careful way she handled each buzzing guardian. Wulfstan listened, fascinated but skeptical. How could these tiny creatures wield such power against men clad in iron and fury? She explained that bees were more than just stingers and honey producers. They were master strategists of their own kind, capable of complex communication through dances and pheromonies. A fact scientist would rediscover centuries later. Their ability to mobilize rapidly and defend their home with deadly precision was an ancient art Ealhgefu had learned from her ancestors and adapted for human warfare. Then came the brewing. Ealhgefu shared the story of her concoctions, the fermented mead mixed with herbs that muddled the enemy's mind and the sting water that burned like fire. She admitted the risk in using such poisons but underscored their effectiveness when combined with the natural chaos created by the bees. A quirky detail she mentioned was that the Saxons once believed that honey could ward off evil spirits and even the plague. Honey jars were sometimes hung in homes not just for sweetness, but as talismans of protection. Wulfstan, absorbing every word, decided to bring Ealhgefu's methods to his own village, promising to honor her cautious approach. He understood that these tools were not weapons of brute force, but instruments of subtlety, requiring patience, respect, and deep knowledge of nature. Their meeting marked the beginning of a slow but lasting change in Saxon defense strategies, blending age-old traditions with new tactics. Meanwhile, Ealhgefu continued to tend her hives with a calm certainty, knowing that her victory was not just a battle won, but a legacy seeded. The bees hummed on, eternal guardians of the land, whispering secrets between the flowers and the wind. Summer brought golden light and the sweet, sticky scent of honey drifting from every corner of Clunwick. The village thrived, shielded not only by walls of timber and stone, but by the invisible web woven by Ealhgefu's bees. She had become more than a beekeeper, she was a guardian, a quiet force whose work resonated beneath the surface of daily life. That summer, a strange phenomenon occurred that left villagers both amused and baffled. Bees from Ealhgefu's hives began to gather in an unusual spot near the village well, buzzing loudly and swarming in peculiar patterns. Curious onlookers watched as the insects created a living sculpture of sorts, a swirling, shimmering shape that resembled a dragon, shimmering in the sunlight. This peculiar event sparked old legends and new stories. Some believed the bees were summoning the spirit of a dragon to protect the village, while others thought it was a sign from the gods, an omen of continued peace or perhaps impending danger. A quirky historical tidbit relates here. Vikings themselves revered dragons, often carving fierce dragon heads on their longships to strike fear into their enemies. The dragon motif was a symbol of power and protection, much like the bees had become for Clunwich. Ealhgefu, however, remained grounded. She understood the bees' behavior as a form of communication, a complex dance that scientists in the future would call the waggle dance, a way for bees to share information about food sources and threats. Her mastery of this dance allowed her to interpret their messages, predicting changes in weather, nearby dangers, and even the moods of the wild animals around her. That summer, her bees' strange gathering coincided with the arrival of a new threat-band of opportunistic raiders from the north, emboldened by tales of Saxon weakness. But this time, the village was ready. The bees, trained and alerted, took to the skies in a dense, buzzing swarm, cutting through the raiders' lines and forcing a chaotic retreat before any swords were drawn. The boiling pits, filled with fragrant herbs and steaming water, were ready but unneeded. The bees had done their job. This victory was quieter, less dramatic than the first, but it was a testament to a new kind of defense, one that respected nature's rhythms and harnessed its subtle power. Ealhgefu watched the retreating raiders from her porch, her bees settling back into their hives, their dragon-shaped dance dissolving into gentle hums. The village sighed with relief, protected by the smallest of warriors. The seasons turned with gentle inevitability, and with each passing year the legend of Ealhgefu grew, though she herself remained quietly in the background, tending to hives, mixing brews, and nurturing her community. But not all battles were fought with bees and boiling pits. Some were fought with words, with the strength of diplomacy and trust. One autumn, representatives from neighboring Saxon villages gathered at Clunwick. They came seeking guidance and protection, wary of the Viking threat that still prowled the edges of their lands. Elgifu, respected for her cunning and courage, was invited to share her knowledge and help forge alliances. The meeting was held under a sprawling oak tree, its leaves blazing red and gold, while bees hummed softly from hives hung nearby. As she spoke, Elgifu explained the importance of harmony, not just among people, but with the natural world. She told of how bees communicated through dances, how the right combination of herbs could protect the mind and body, and how patience often outmatched brute force. Her words wove a vision of a future where villages could stand strong together, not just with swords, but with wisdom. A quirky detail from this period is that Saxon leaders often held councils outdoors, believing that the earth and sky bore witness to their promises and decisions. Nature was not separate but deeply entwined with their governance. The villagers listened, intrigued by the idea that their survival depended not only on strength, but on knowledge passed quietly through generations, like the secret language of bees. Elgifu's influence began to ripple beyond Clunwich. Neighboring villages adopted her beekeeping techniques, her herbal brews, and her methods of subtle defense. This created a network of communities linked by trust and shared wisdom, ready to face threats as one. Through diplomacy and the quiet hum of bees, Elgifu helped build a safer Saxon world, one where even the smallest voice, like a bee's buzz, could carry great power. Winter settled over the land, blanketing the fields in frost and silencing much of the village's usual bustle. Yet inside Elgifu's modest home, warmth radiated not just from the fire, but from a deep sense of peace and accomplishment. The bees were resting in their hives, clustered tightly, conserving energy through the cold months, and the village was secure. Elgifu reflected on the years since the Viking attack, the chaos, the fear, and the ingenious victory born from boiling liquids and buzzing wings. She had become a living bridge between the old ways and the new, a keeper of secrets older than the hills. In this quiet winter, she turned her attention to passing on her knowledge. She taught children about bees, not just as creatures, but as symbols of community, cooperation, and resilience. She showed them how the bees worked together selflessly, how their roles workers, guards, and queens mirrored the needs of any strong society. A curious fact she shared with the children was that bees could remember faces, recognizing friendly humans from strangers, a rare ability in the insect world. This fascinated the kids, who imagined bees as tiny guardians with memories and purpose. Elgifu also taught them to make their own brews sweetmeads, infused with calming herbs, and to respect the land that nurtured their hives. Her lessons were gentle but firm, ensuring the legacy of survival through wisdom and kindness. Outside, the village grew quieter under the snow, but inside, life hummed softly with promise. Elgifu's story had become part of the fabric of Clunwich, not just as legend, but as living tradition. And through the silence of winter, the bees' promise buzzed softly of renewal, protection, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing the world's smallest wonders. Spring unfurled once more with gentle rains and the soft awakening of blossoms. The village of Clunwick stirred from its winter hush, filled with fresh hope and quiet gratitude. Elgifu stood outside her home, watching the bees emerge from their hives, the tiny creatures shimmering gold in the sunlight as they took to the air once more. Her story was no longer just about battle or survival, it was about harmony, patience, and the wisdom found in nature's rhythms. The bees that had once been weapons of defense now symbolized something far deeper: connection, resilience, and the delicate balance of life. The village had transformed alongside her, growing stronger not through war but through unity and understanding. Neighboring communities had embraced her teachings, weaving their lives closer with threads of trust and shared knowledge. And though the threat of Viking raids still lingered in the edges of memory, It was tempered by the enduring spirit Elgifu had kindled. A quirky, little-known fact, the Saxons often used honey as a natural preservative, coating fruits and meats to keep them fresh longer. It was a humble practice, but one that spoke to their deep respect for the gifts of nature, an extension of the same reverence that had saved Clunwich. As twilight settled, Elgifa's gaze softened, and a peaceful smile curved her lips. She knew the bees would continue their eternal dance long after she was gone, a buzzing lullaby for generations to come. In that quiet moment, the village exhaled with the gentle sigh of a world at rest, wrapped in the warm embrace of bees and blooming flowers. The story of a Saxon woman who crushed a Viking army with boiling piss and bees had blossomed into a timeless reminder that sometimes the smallest creatures, armed with the cleverness of the heart and the wisdom of the wild, hold the greatest power of all. And as the stars twinkled softly overhead, the village drifted into a deep, gentle sleep. The night deepens slowly now, and the world around Clunwich softens into a quiet hush. Imagine the bees gently settling into their honeyed homes, their wings folding as the last light slips beyond the horizon. The village rests under a velvet sky, where stars twinkle like distant fires kindled by ancient hands. Elgifa's story, woven with the buzzing of bees and the warmth of boiling pits, becomes a gentle echo, a reminder that true strength often hums quietly beneath the surface. It's not the clash of swords or the roar of battle that shapes the course of history, but the steady courage found in patience, in understanding the whispers of nature, and in the cleverness of a single determined woman. Let your thoughts drift with the bees, carried on soft breezes through wildflowers and sleepy forests. Feel the calm that comes from knowing the smallest things, like a sting or a drop of honey, can change the world in ways unseen. The land breathes with you now, and the steady hum of life settles around your heart. Rest easy, wrapped in the peaceful song of the natural world, where even the wildest storms give way to calm. Tomorrow will bring new light, but tonight you are safe, cradled in the quiet strength of bees and the timeless wisdom of those who listen. Good night, and may your dreams be sweet, like honey dripping slowly from a golden comb. End of script. Good night.